Hello, I'm Susan Marsden of Marsden Szwarcbord Foundation's Making History at Home series. This is actually our next session on what to do with all those photographs. And as you can see behind me, I've got quite a range of examples here of how one organised one's photos when they were family prints. All the albums one used to put in, little photo books that one's mother had done when I was very small, and also brag books. I used to call these grandparents' brag books with the little plastic sleeves. So there's lots of examples of how to put photos together and how to share them, and at the same time, as we will say later on, there are also ways you can still print things so that there are still photo books that one can do. And I want to talk about that later, but I want to first emphasise that photographs are quite possibly our most important possessions. When anyone is asked in Australia, what would you grab to run out of the house when the bushfire is bearing down on you, almost everyone will say the photos and the photo albums, or the hard drive if you've got your family photos on all the hard drives. Because we are well aware of the fact that they're often unique. And so it's very important, therefore, to keep them properly and to organise them properly and to share them, as those three things are the most important. Family photographs. And a friend of mine who is also a professional historian, Patricia Summerlin, I've got several of her books here, is going to tell us about a lovely way of collectively identifying who the people are in family photographs.
Family history, when you haven't really thought about it and you've got the whole family coming for lunch and they've got a big box of photographs and they haven't got a clue what to do with it, then you use them as a workshop. And what I have done with a particular family was round a huge table at which 24 people were sitting, or about that number. We passed the photographs around and I asked everybody with their soft pencils that I'd provided to put a date, the name of the place and the person on the back of the photo, and if they didn't know, to pass it on to the next person. And within about 2 hours we'd done about 100 to 150 photographs.
And what did they think about this?
They thought it was marvellous because so many photographs that nobody knew about, there was always someone else there who said, oh yes, I remember, that's Uncle Joe with his horse Ginger.
We're talking about what to do with all those photographs, and I'd just like to remind you how important photographs are, not only for yourself and your family, but also, you might not quite realise it, but as time moves on, even quite banal photographs you might think of, just family, immediate family, or your house or your environs, assume some historical interest for a much broader community. And sometimes that means, and certainly been the case in my own work, that you might, this is beautiful front cover photograph, which actually was a glass negative. It's actually the Port Road, traffic along the Port Road in Adelaide. And someone wrote to me quite recently, he's actually written a book about this photographer who was in his family. He thinks this is actually a very rare snowfall in South Australia. So you do get these lovely ways of sharing things and beautiful images. This is a lovely one, Mr. Sosner and his wife celebrating Christmas 1951 or 52 with neighbours whose shanty is on the left, bushes in the background, up Oxthorn. This is in what is now, of course, a very built up suburb of Woodville South in South Australia. But this was the post-war migrants who actually had to really, in effect, camp out while they built their own housing after the Second World War. So that's just family photographs. And the same thing here in another book I wrote later. Here's a family who lent me their photographs who were tenants of the South Australian Housing Trust, the public housing. So they're there in the wartime. You can see one of them is wearing his war uniform. And here this little boy is in the family's air raid shelter, which they dug in the back garden. Not that South Australia was actually bombed, but the Northern Australia was during the war. So you can see those are two nice examples of family history that actually has broader application. and there might be your workplace, there might be a whole range of ways and use. So it is worth, once you've identified things, thinking about who else might be interested in these, whether it's within your own family or more broadly in a publication or in a local library. You may even want to give the originals to a library collection where they can be looked after. And if you are going to be doing that too, here's 3 examples of photographs of my early working career as a young heritage activist on Kangaroo Island, at Port Lincoln, and up on the upper River Murray in South Australia, in key historical sites, heritage sites. Now these are beautiful prints taken by my partner in that work, John Dalwitz, and I have framed them because he has the originals and the negatives, or the department has the originals and the negatives. But you will also notice they are kept in a very dark part of the room, so they don't have full daylight falling on them. So you have all these photographs. What do you do with them all? There's 2 big things you need to do. Firstly, you need to look after them, and Sandra will talk about this in a minute. And secondly, of course, you need to organise them. So we'll talk about that now.
So how do we go about organising our photographs? One of the easiest ways is to actually gather up the material in a acid-free archive box. You can also get acid-free sleeves, and if you feel that this may be too expensive or too difficult to obtain, although they are readily available around South Australia and Adelaide in particular, you can also do a very basic thing of using a shoebox. And this is a really good way of storing your photographs. It's got a lid, it keeps the dust out, it's in a dark area, and in this instance there's actually postcards, and the postcards are divided up into different territories or states. You also have such things as an album, and I know we talked about these earlier where we said not to use adhesive sleeves, but in this instance this album is non-adhesive. It also provides you little pockets to put each postcard or photograph, and it gives you an area where you can jot down some information, and it means you minimize the handling of the photograph or postcard that you have in this book. And some of these are also available where they're archival standard and they're acid free.
We're talking about organising, as we've been saying all along, organise, organise, organise. And I suggested that in some instances you might like to keep things as they were, because they're actually a very good, reasonably archival quality way of keeping things, and also telling you what they're about. So here, for example, and this is very common tradition, the wedding album. And this is my parents' wedding album in 1951. And it's beautifully organised. So you're in a solid album. You have the wonderful dividers between each photograph, and they're all printed on hard backing with hard backing in between each photograph. So keep this together. And at the front, as it happens, probably my mother stuck the news cutting about the wedding itself. She didn't date it, but I can check our wonderful resource in Australia, the Trove, the treasure house of all things, including digitised newspaper accounts. So I know I can find that. I have seen it with a photograph in that digital mechanism, and I would add it here as well as possibly printed off from Trove itself. The other point about this album, because my mother's still alive, it's the whole business about when you're organising, you're identifying, dating, identifying the place, the date, the people. I can ask. In my case, I'm lucky enough to still have my mother around, and I actually have been working with my mother and putting some of the photographs up. Here we are, looking through this lovely trunk that was her father's, that he took off in their 20s. And there she is looking at some photos where she is identifying her father in the 1920s. So we're talking about nearly a century ago, and where that was in northern New South Wales. And in that trunk, amongst other things, is this rather lovely silhouette, which was very common pre-photography, and it was probably done in possibly the 1840s or 1850s back in England, and someone properly, a long time ago, has put on the back Anne Greenfield Hornibrook, born January 1831, married John Martin, 1850, Launceston, Cornwall, England. So means it was done after she married, presumably. And the cross-referencing I'm talking about, when you're talking about how you identify your photos and organise them, here's a self-published family history of the Hornibrook family, published in 1978. And here's a little bit about Anne Hornibrook in here. So, in fact, interestingly, she didn't actually know exactly when Anne married John Martin, and here it is on the back of this family photograph, or family pre-photograph. You have to remember, this is where you can be helped by identifying photos. Sandra and I were talking earlier today about remembering older members of the family with their box brownies. You had to look down into them like this. You have even the packets that photographs might still be kept in can help you actually date them, at least approximately. So use all this ancillary information as well to help organise your photographs.
So as we discussed earlier on about preserving your photographs in boxes or albums, this is a great way of keeping them safe and preventing them from yellowing and fading and curling up. But another great way of preserving them is to digitise them. And the advantage of that is you can actually share them with other family members, you can get a discussion going, and you can also organise them into folders. But do be mindful that digitisation changes all the time, programs update, and there may come a point where you won't be able to access them. So always keep an eye on the various programs that are available and what you can do to actually keep things like your photographs safe and accessible. And don't forget, there's also family films or videos, and they're also important, and especially in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, where people have been online FaceTiming and talking, and they're also really important items to preserve. Another thing to look at as well is the programs that we can use, and they are things like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And these are really important because they're a way of actually appealing to a wider audience, of getting a conversation going as to who's in what photographs. And even recently we had 2 photographs that were uploaded onto our hashtag MSZF, Make History at Home. And a person within the photograph was able to comment and add to the story of the photograph that was put on to the site. And you might want to check that out next time you're on Instagram.
We're talking about, we're kind of bringing this whole session about what to do with all those photographs back full circle. We started downstairs talking about photo albums of various kinds, including the most recent, which are of course printing out your digital photos in either as individual prints, which is probably not such a good idea unless you want to use them for something, because otherwise you then have to treat them like ordinary prints and put them in albums. But printing photo books is a nice way of doing this, and I had some examples downstairs, and some friends have done. A visit to Italy in 2006, a set of photos of my daughter's babyhood, a trip that we did as a family to Cambodia. Or you could do year by year books. I've made a lot of gift books over the years for small children, older people. My mother's last decade ago birthday was my first photo book. And of course, digitized the photos and then printed them. But then in fact, you're going backwards and forwards. This photograph, which is actually a tiny photo, I have got the original, of the Hornibrook family in about 1916. So as you can see, this is a printout from the digitized version of it, but I have kept the original as well. The point is that because digital photos may not last any length of time, just as you need probably to digitize your key prints in order to save them, preserve them and share them and sort them, you also really need to think about printing out in some form or other your key digital photographs. And I think that's a very important thing to say. Of course, you can also share your digital photos in other platforms and other medium. And it might well be that you share your digital photos with, for example, the State Library of South Australia or the History Trust. There's a lot of places at the moment asking for your memoirs and your photographs of the pandemic, and similarly in Australia of the bushfire season we just had last summer. But the real point is what we engineers call redundancy. And redundancy in engineering terms means you have more than one way of doing things, so that if one fails, you still have the other alternative. And that's really what we're talking about with your really precious photograph. We've talked about looking after your photos, so now let's start on organising them and break it down. Don't try and do everything at once. That's the first point to make. You might like to start with your digital photos, maybe not with your family prints if they're in reasonable nick, but firstly just assemble them. So if you have, as I have, a lot of family old prints and in fact documents and what have you, you may well start with decent boxes. Could be shoe boxes, could be archival quality boxes. Keeping them together with other documents for the time being is probably a good idea too, because of course you've got other information that goes with them. So I've tended to make all these shelves here, the family archives in a way, so that I've actually got, and including notes that I've taken over the years. But just get them together, as Sandra said earlier, gently clean them off if they're dusty, rescue them from the shed. I've got a photograph of an example of a recent rescue I made myself from my mother's collection. And pull them all together. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is to make a plan before you start trying to organise things. How do you want to arrange your photos? You've got a whole range of choices here. The obvious thing to do is year by year. If it's mainly your own and your immediate family photographs, that might be the simplest way of doing things, literally year by year. If it's more complicated, you may want to do the different families, your various different families. You may even want to do it geographically. Thinking with Sandra, for example, in a way, like a lot of people who've moved countries, she's actually got her Irish life, her Australian life. Luckily for her, it divides quite neatly into the 20th century and the 21st century. So there's all various ways of dividing things, and certainly you can divide them other ways as well. The chronological one is probably the easiest, and this means digital photos as well as your prints. And I have here as an example myself. I'm still doing this. It's a work in progress. We'll just walk around. So what I've done is started to do, as you can see with my digital photos, of which there are many, like many people I take lots. I've just created family and friends album, and then literally this first one is a very large period of time, 19th century to 1979. And you can see I just dropped into it photographs that I've actually scanned myself. Some of them are actually copies and photos of, this is from the Australian War Memorial. That's my dad as a very young fighter pilot in the Second World War. And if we go back, you can see this is also more immediate family photos, which I've begun to scan from my own albums, and in fact from a painting by my mother-in-law, baby Sam. And then literally some of the earlier ones I've done quite a big period of time, and then more recently down to when you started this. So the point is it's basically chronological, and 2 sets are pre-digital and the rest are digital photographs. One of the things that we've also been doing for Marsden Szwarcbord Foundation is also using family photos and other people's family photos. And if on Instagram as well, we've been doing the same thing and posting photographs which include other people have done. But you can see here, for example, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 historical, if you like, photos over quite a long span of time, which we've then posted to Instagram as an illustration of what we're talking about, together with more recent photographs and photographs in a couple of instances of text. Don't forget those things as well. And as you know, with digital photographs, you can compile them into little sets of photographs that tell a whole story. That's one of my little pandemic memoirs. So you can check out the MSZF Make History at Home on Instagram.